Hello and welcome back from the networking break. You've made it to our final set of sessions for the day. Welcome everybody. This one is our cyber intel deep. This one encompasses March and April. We've got a real good lowdown of what's happening in the world, and then also kind of what's happening, more locally within each of the different in the U.S. and North America. So, without further ado, we've got a lot of ground to cover. I want to introduce our gentleman here. We have Colonel Cedric Leighton. He is a retired United States Air Force colonel. He's the co-founder and co-partner over at Cyphorix. And he's also a CNN military analyst. Busy guy, as you might imagine, in this day and age that we're living in right now. But we're lucky to have him here. And joined with him is his business partner, VJ Viswanathan. He is the co-founder and partner over at Cyphorix as well. Managing director at Torque, senior external advisor at Bain & Company. And you can see the list of places where he was actually a former CISO. Places you've heard of Keurig, Dr. Pepper, Comcast, 3D Supply, just to name some of them. These guys know what they're talking about. I'm going to let them tell us about the state of the world and cyber. Cedric, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's great to be with you and VJ again. And we wanted to really give a kind of a state of play, if you will, for this version of the Global Intel Debrief for March and April of 2024. So I'll go ahead and get right to it. So there have been several things that have been going on. Some of them are kind of surprising in the sense that we know that stuff is going on, but now the news has come out about these things. Some of these events occurred as far back as 2021, but they've only now been talked about openly. And so one of the things we'll talk about is how China is targeting several countries. These happen to be English-speaking ones, the US, UK, and New Zealand, and what they're actually going after in this area. Plus, on the Russian side of things, German political parties have been hit by Russia's APT-29. And then we'll, of course, look at what has happened between Russia and Ukraine, not only in the war, but some of the bigger aspects as far as that conflict is concerned, as well as drones versus jammers. So we basically have to look at that and then talk a little bit about what I call the fleeting asymmetric advantage in that conflict. So when it comes to the kinds of events that we're looking at here, the Chinese have been, let us just say, active. A few months ago, we started talking about Volt Typhoon and how Volt Typhoon got into the infrastructure and kind of a living off the land type of cyber attack, a fileless cyber attack going after critical elements on air bases, such as the one in Guam, Anderson Air Force Base, infrastructure, in terms of water supply, electricity, all those kinds of things. But in this particular case, we have some very interesting developments because the target set is not just typical infrastructure, the kinds of things that we deal with in our everyday life, also political. So what just happened is that the Department of Justice in the U.S. has charged 7 Chinese nationals from the People's Republic of China with conspiracy. And they've sanctioned 2 Chinese companies for being basically fronts for the Ministry of State Security. That's one of the Chinese intelligence services. This has been attributed to APT-31, and basically what we're dealing with here is targeting of companies, targeting of members of Congress, including senators and representatives from both political parties, and we also see them going after defense contractors. No surprise there, they've done this before, but now it's kind of coming out into the open that this is the kind of thing that has been ongoing for a while. So it's part of a broader Chinese strategy to go after people of influence, companies that are putting out technologies that are worth the Chinese looking at and possibly emulating or copying. And then of course, political influence, either, who's in charge of what, so kind of a benign way of looking at things, who has the most influence, but then also trying to influence the influencers, if you will. And that's the kind of thing that the Chinese have been doing not only in the US, but guess what? They've also been doing it in the UK. In fact, over the last several years, they've done things like getting into the election system, where they maintain the voting rolls basically the registration data for all voters in the United Kingdom. They have basically gone after and found the voting records of 40 million UK voters. So that would be the entire electorate. And they've also targeted members of parliament who are critical of the People's Republic of China, whether it's critical of their politics, of their human rights records, or of actions that the Chinese are undertaking on the global stage. So emails have been targeted. In this case, as far as is publicly known at least, the targeting of the members of parliament's emails has been unsuccessful, but the fact that it happened indicates what the target list is really like. And then one other thing to note is that not only did they go after rank and file members of the parliament, but they also went after a former Conservative Party leader. And again, APT 31 was involved in that. Now, in New Zealand, going across the Pacific, we have involvement by APT 40, which handles a lot of maritime affiliated targets. But in this case, a similar target set. They went after New Zealand's parliament. Emails were hacked in that particular area, and they also tracked high-level political figures, their whereabouts, what they were doing, all of these kinds of things. Plus, they also went after trade data from corporations. So all of these kinds of activities have been attributed to two APTs, two advanced persistent threats emanating out of China, APT 31 and APT 40, both of which are associated with elements of China's state security apparatus. So these elements are, of course, critical when it comes to China's goals of going after critical infrastructure, going after people of influence, and going after corporations. Now, on the other side of the world, in Europe, the Russians have been active. And in this particular case, APT 29, which is associated with the SVR, or Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, also known as Cozy Bear, the Dukes, or Nobelium. And if you remember, these people were the same ones that conducted the SolarWinds hack. What they did here was they send out emails. In this particular case, you see this invitation for the CDU, or the Christian Democratic Union, with what looks like the cyber version of, or the email version of letterhead, using the Christian Democratic Union logo to invite people to a dinner. So what they did, APT 29 launched what we call a multi-stage malware attack, and that included basically phishing lures that were, if they were clicked on, that would then open into a new backdoor that has been codenamed Wine Loader. So these phishing emails were baked in, or invitations that had, as I mentioned, the CDU, Christian Democratic Union Party logo on them. That's a major political party in Germany right now. And that these invites were designed to get people to not only click on things, but also, of course, that backdoor was then designed to wreak havoc on the victim's computer systems. And what it did was basically the link led to a malicious zip file, and that had in it a malware dropper that's codenamed Rootsaw. Rootsaw is hosted on an APT29 controlled website. So what you have here is a very concerted effort to go after political players of influence. And it's very clear that instead of going after intelligence targets or military targets, which they do, they're also going after a political party. They've discovered that one of their pathways to success on the Russian side is to engage in influence operations, and there's no better place to conduct influence operations than to actually go in and target political parties, and specifically members of political parties. We're going to be very busy doing the things that they do, and of course they're going to click on a dinner invite from the party, right? So that's why the Russians have done this, and they are, of course, actively trying to pursue this. The German authorities have tried to stop this, but this is an ongoing effort by the Russians to destabilize the German political system, especially because of Germany's support for Ukraine in the Ukraine-Russia war. And speaking of the Ukraine-Russia war, a lot going on in that arena, although we don't often see the headlines of it here in the United States. But we did, of course, in the last week or so, focus on the attack on the Crocus City Concert Hall in Krasnogorsk, which is a suburb of Moscow. At least 137 and probably higher numbers now have been killed, and that's according to Russian state media. The responsibility for that particular attack was claimed by ISIS-K, or ISIS Khorasan, this element of the Islamic State that is active in Afghanistan and was one of the prime targets of the U.S. During the latter part of our involvement in Afghanistan, especially at the end where we did hit several ISIS Khorasan targets. So a lot of elements here are, wondering why ISIS Khorasan would do something like that with Russia. Well, the key thing is that the Russians have had a long involvement in Central Asia. They used to control a lot of the Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all those countries north of Afghanistan. The Russians, of course, themselves were involved in Afghanistan. And ISIS Khorasan looks at Russia as being a major target, a major anti-Islamic force, and they have a lot of justification for that in their view because Russia is actively supporting an anti-ISIS government in Syria, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which is supported by the Iranians and the Russians, and there have been clashes between ISIS elements and the Russians as the Russians have put their forces into Syria to shore up the Assad regime there. Now, in the actual physical war that is happening between Russia and Ukraine, there was a period over a couple of days ago where Russia launched 57 airstrikes on both Kyiv, the capital, and Lviv, the major city in the western part of Ukraine. That's just symptomatic of some of the things that the Russians have done. They've basically thrown every kind of missile that they have, to include hypersonic missiles, at targets in those areas that are not near the front lines in many cases. And they're doing that to impact the civilian infrastructure in those regions, thus weakening, in their view, the war effort. Now, Ukraine is not passively sitting back and letting all this happen, even though they have had a lot of problems with their air defenses. Ukraine has struck Russian naval targets in Crimea. They've hit at least 2 vessels, and they've also hit a communication center in Crimea, which the Russians have occupied since 2014. Another thing that to note is that transport systems in Sevastopol, the major city in Crimea, have been damaged as a result of the Ukrainian attacks. And it's noteworthy because the Ukrainians are basically using asymmetric warfare in order to achieve these gains. They don't have the kind of military presence. In other words, they don't have a real navy in the common sense of that term compared to the Russians, but they've been able to destroy at least a third of Russia's naval forces that are assigned to the Black Sea Fleet. And Russia has basically had to cede a large portion of the Western Black Sea to the Ukrainian efforts. And the other thing to note on land, although the Ukrainians have been gaining on the sea and on the Black Sea and been allowed to export their grain through the western part of the Black Sea, there have been some Russian gains on land, especially near the town of Divka, which the Ukrainians had held for a long time, and it recently fell to the Russians. The Russians have moved a bit further in that area, but basically we still have a stalemate in the land war along those front lines, both in the eastern and southern portions of Ukraine. Now, one of the key elements of the war between Ukraine and Russia is the drone aspect of this. And this is where asymmetric elements really do come into play. In fact, the way the Minister of Digital Transformation in Ukraine talks about this, he calls this a war of engineers and a war of economies. So on the engineering side, of course, it's all about the talent. And the Ukrainians, up until this point, have been able to leverage their talent in very creative ways to create asymmetric advantages for the Ukrainian forces. On the economic side of things, the Ukrainian economy is far less powerful, far less robust than Russia's economy, just in terms of its size. And Russia is now on a war footing, so that changes a lot of things. Plus, they have a lot more manpower than the Ukrainians do. So let's take a look at this for a second. And as far as the drones are concerned, local production is basically up 100 times in Ukraine, and they've got over 200 companies that on average produce somewhere between 12 and 15 drones each per month. The goal is to make Ukraine, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, their goal is to make Ukraine a world center of drone manufacturing and development. And certainly from a technical standpoint, they've been able to do a lot of different things. And they're also using AI, artificial intelligence, to track targets. So now you're beginning to see the integration of autonomous warfare, at least autonomous targeting, into this conflict. And that will have impacts on how this war moves forward, and it will have further impacts on how other wars are conducted in the future. So we'll have to pay attention to this and see how AI is used by both sides, and whether one side or another uses advantages, whether they are moral or immoral, illegal or legal, it will probably be in the eye of the beholder, and it will also be something that we'll have to take a look at in terms of how we structure our forces. But Russia is learning, of course, from its mistakes and Ukraine's successes. The Russians have something known as an Orlan 10 drone, and that is basically for surveillance purposes. And then they also have a Lancet or attack drones, and they actually fly them together. What we see here at the top are the Orlan 10s. They also produce or procure, with the help of Iran, over 100,000 drones a month. Now, that means, of course, that there's going to be a sky full of these things, and we're beginning to talk about the possibility of drone swarms, creating a whole new dynamic on the battlefield. In addition to the drones being out there, of course, what the Russians are doing is they're trying to cut the radio links between the drone and the drone's controllers. So Russian jammers have been deployed, as you see at the bottom here. That's an example of one type of Russian jammer. They're highly effective as part of a very successful Russian electronic warfare campaign. Ukraine loses about 10,000 drones a month, in part due to this jamming effort. GPS is highly vulnerable, and that helps control the drones. It also helps target the Ukrainians use that to help their artillery reach its targets. And so GPS is integral to Western weapon systems, and it's also been integral to Ukraine using the Starlink system that Elon Musk had developed, or had his folks develop. But all of these things that use GPS are highly vulnerable. And as far as Starlink is concerned, the Russians are using that signal. The Ukrainians have found Starlink terminals on their side, and they've tried their best to destroy as many of them as possible. But clearly, in spite of sanctions, Starlink terminals are getting to the Russians. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind is if Starlink goes down, if GPS is not usable, if the jamming continues, then targeting effectiveness is reduced. And the kinds of things that you're dealing with here really mean that the Ukrainians are in a bit of a bind because of production shortfalls, because of the kinds of things that they are dealing with in terms of lack of aid from the West. That is going to create a significant problem for them to be able to move forward in this conflict. And then one other thing to keep in mind as we consider the drone situation, there is basically a fleeting asymmetric advantage. The Ukrainians have done a magnificent job. They've basically punched far above their weight during these first 2 years of this war, of this phase of the war. And the key thing here, though, is that the Ukrainians were innovative enough to use asymmetric warfare techniques basically from the start, and technologies and Western weapons and munitions. But that advantage is basically coming to an end because Russia is a very adaptive enemy. They have a huge advantage in population, about 141 million people in Russia to about 43 million or less in Ukraine. And Ukraine has lost a considerable amount of its population since independence back in 1991. Russia also has a huge advantage in military manpower. About 1.3 million people under arms in the Russian military compared to 900,000. If the Russians mobilize, like we think they will, even more people, then you can see about armies of 300,000 or so hitting the field in Ukraine. Ukraine will have to change its mobilization mechanisms, get younger people into the military to combat that. And even then, it might not be enough. And then also the GDP, the gross domestic product. Before this phase of the conflict, GDP in Russia was about 10 times larger than Ukraine's. And key thing, though, key asterisk here is that Ukraine's grew much more than Russia's, almost 71% growth in Ukraine compared to Russia's relatively modest, comparatively 8.8% in the period between 2015 and 2020. So the key thing here, though, is that Russia is on a war footing. Russia produces about 3 times as many artillery shells as the US and Europe combined. Of course, US and Europe are not only supplying Ukraine, but they're also replenishing their own stockpiles. So this is going to be another problem. Our defense industrial base has to keep up with them if Ukraine is going to keep its territory. Also, each Russian shell costs about $600 to produce. A Western shell, because of safety mechanisms that are put into the Western production process and other factors, costs about $6,000. So that's also a difference. And then those drones. Like I mentioned earlier, Russia produces about 100,000 drones a month. Ukraine plans to produce somewhere around 83,000 a month, so basically about 1 million drones a year. That's the kind of thing that they're looking at and hoping that they can gain that advantage in a way that will allow them to actually do the job that they need in order to protect their country, their sovereignty, and perhaps roll back the Russians even more. But that ability to roll the Russians back, that has basically come to a stop because both sides are engaged in what amounts to a stalemate, at least on the ground in the east and in the south. So that gives you a basic idea of the state of play that is going on in the world right now from a cyber intel perspective. And now we can take a look at this and let you know that as soon as things happen in Ukraine, things can change. Momentum can shift again. There are various factors that impact that momentum. There's internal political strife, certainly available in Russia. Ukraine has been relatively united up until this point, but political strife can happen there as well. Changes in conscription laws could make a difference. Then also there are renewed weapons deliveries from the US and Europe that could change the equation. Plus the promised F-16s, there's training going on of Ukrainian pilots in places like Romania and Denmark. And if the Ukrainians overcome jamming and have other technological breakthroughs, they might be able to achieve some gains that will give them an advantage on at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. And of course, if AI is used in the battle space, whoever uses AI most effectively has a chance to really affect the outcome of this war. And with that, I'll give it over to VJ for the Global Cyber Debrief. VJ?
Great. Thank you, Cedric. If you kind of listen to what Cedric just captured, the line between strategic defense and cybersecurity, it's kind of overshadowing almost on a daily basis. So in this episode of Global Cyber Debrief, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the world of DDoS and DOS, denial of service attacks. Let's also take a look at what's really changing in the cloud economy and how the modern DDoS attacks are actually causing more damage. Let's also take a look at ITG-05. This is the Russian state-sponsored actor. Let's take a look at the latest TTP tools, techniques, and procedures used by the Russian operator. And I also wanted to bring to everybody's attention, if you're not aware, let's talk about the issues we are seeing with CVE database, the EU AI law introduction, a very big topic. And then finally, let's quickly refresh on our guidance to threat management of AI systems, what I've seen in the field as we engage with our clients. Now, we all are familiar, since about 20, 25 years, what a standard DOS attack is. It's basically flooding the network and saturating it. But if you think about the way we are operating right now, we are serverless, we are headless entities in terms of operating in the cloud. We deal with a lot of containers. We don't necessarily deal with the traditional setup, so to speak, that is in your data center. But on the same token, there is still quite a bit of the same, which is your layer 3, which is the network side. Now, what we are seeing within the past 6 months alone, we have actually dealt with well over 11 different DDoS attacks as part of our client engagements. And this is a little bit concerning. And the reason it's concerning for us is we are beginning to notice a series of more optimized attacks that are designed not just to exploit the network capacity and saturate them, but the attacks are also going on at a higher level, which is the protocol-based attacks, and finally at the application layer. So it's imperative when you're designing modern architecture that is at cloud scale, cloud economy, you really need to think through the dimensions of how we want to go ahead and basically defend against complex DDoS attacks. So to break this down, there's volume-based attacks, there's protocol-based attacks, and application layer attacks. Now, one of the best things that we have found as part of engaging with a lot of these client engagements is doing a proactive risk assessment against all the three areas. That's your core volume-based attacks scenario, which means you essentially have IDS, IPS, intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system, and you're essentially building a set of capabilities primarily on your DNS layer, your WAF or web application firewall layer, or your entry point, which is your gateway layer. So if you leverage third-party services that can front-end some of your most critical infrastructure, critical application, you can basically offload a whole lot of these DDoS attacks directly before even it hits your environment. The second thing that we are noticing is there's a lot of bot activity that is exploiting cloud implementation. So let's kind of dig a little bit deeper into that. We're all familiar with news items that comes around that is an exposed data bucket in AWS cloud or Azure cloud. But if you're deploying a CI/CD, that is DevOps application directly in the cloud, and that is data leakage, data exposure, then your protocol-based attacks becomes pretty easier because everything in the cloud is basically east to west and north to south is software driven. So it's highly important as you design these modern solutions that you really want to come up with a game plan on creating visibility and transparency. This could be network layer visibility monitoring, it could be application layer visibility monitoring, but the sooner you're able to detect these attack patterns before it enters your estate, your cloud estate, it's easier to protect it rather than cause any type of irreparable harm, which is basically shutting down your core infrastructure. The last area is where it's really interesting. Out of the 11 different engagements that we have did, about 8 of them had to deal with application layer attacks. And this primarily revolved around exploitation of vulnerabilities that were either inherent as part of the application stack or the development itself was less secure. In other words, if you were to bring in a CI/CD code-based security model, or if you're doing traditional application, doing application security review for traditional OSSSec, all of these really go a long way in understanding the true vulnerability that you have, and in terms of your web applications and how you can minimize the impact of these application layer attacks. So some of the things that we did really quick, these are very fundamental, very basic, completing risk assessments, primarily driven towards DDoS, especially if you're running in the cloud. Running risk assessments in the cloud is critical. Network monitoring, which we already touched about. Traffic analysis is a very important baseline. There are enough tools right now in the market that are inline. Inline meaning as the traffic goes through your gateway, you can quickly decipher the type of traffic, the pattern of traffic, and you can ID them really quick. That's your core traffic analysis. Things like implementing CAPTCHA, Google's CAPTCHA capability, or any type of capability that involves validating traffic patterns. That way you can quickly detect bot traffic versus human traffic, synthetic traffic versus human traffic. Finally, you need to have an incident response plan, especially if you have a highly visible public-facing service or a website. An incident response plan becomes absolutely crucial. And to layer on top of that, one of the key items in an incident response plan, because the ones that we have seen in the past few months, there is an incident response plan, but there is no DDoS mitigation service as part of the plan. So a DDoS mitigation service are dedicated service providers who actually offload the attack volume, and they can put in some preventative controls during attack and take off the load in terms of all the attacks coming through. So I think that's an important call out as you update your incident response plan. And if you think about the application layer security, patching and patch management also becomes a very crucial point of discussion. And lastly, how do you deal with the PR? How do you communicate this particular issue, both internally and externally? That's your communication plan. And we noticed, except for 2 different engagements, every one of them did not have a PR plan that effectively communicated what happened to the service and what the service disruption was. In the era of SEC filing, right? In the era of being more transparent, it becomes very critical to come up with a game plan before the actual battle really occurs. Now, let's dig a little bit more into, on the same token of DDoS services, into the next transition of ITG-05. Now, most of you are familiar with ITG-05 because of their past. Just a quick refresher here. It's a Russian state-sponsored operator. It's actually a group that consists of multiple activity clusters based on what we are noticing, based on multiple security researches that we have seen in the market. It's an overlap of APT28, UAC28, Fancy Bear, everyone remembers Fancy Bear, and of course, Forest Blizzard. Now, ITG-05 kind of leverages all of these TTPs, and they seem to be building more on these capabilities. Their sustained operations in tempo and their continuous evolving methodologies is likely because of the consistent funding that they're able to get in order to go ahead and develop newer attack strategies. Now, if you look at the newer TTPs that are coming through, MaceSpy, CredoMap, all of these are newer attack vectors. And if you look at what they're really trying to drill down is, as of Feb 2024, the last time we baselined this along with a couple of industry researchers, they're running multiple phishing campaigns, impersonating Argentina, Ukraine, Georgia, Poland, Armenia, and of course, United States. In other words, the lures that they are laying out, as you see in the diagram here, these are publicly available PDF documents, but these PDF documents becomes laced. And by lacing, we mean there is some sort of a malware payload. There is a webhook that goes into it. There are different TTPs and all of the ones that are listed out earlier, the MaceSpy and such. But what's different here is they're impersonating each one of these countries' operation, either at the government level or at the private level. Now, the uncovered lures, basically, they tend to feature a mixture of internal and publicly available documents, and mostly it's generated by the threat actor. And by generated, we mean leveraging AI. They generate realistic-looking documents, but also has code embedded in it. Now, ITG-05 also leverages lures featuring topics including finance, critical infrastructure, executive engagements, maritime, and then healthcare, and most importantly, defense industrial production. In other words, they are covering quite a few verticals in the market, and it's a highly organized operation, which is consistently causing more damage. Now, why is this really important from an enterprise perspective? More than likely, your security systems have already experienced attacks from ITGOFI. The easiest entry point in any company is the email. And if your email system is unable to detect some of these complex attack patterns, especially laced PDF files, it's rather easy to gain entry into the system just through your front door, that is your email. So in order to defend against this, you also need to understand the modern threat vectors. And the more we dig deeper into advanced, our AI-based, our machine learning-based email security model, and doing the fundamentals right, blocking domains that were registered very recently, for example, and then basically creating standard threat management attack vectors, creating email signatures, creating digital signatures for your email when you communicate out for trusted documents. There's quite a bit of the standard basic practices, pretty much Microsoft, pretty much any of the security vendors out there is going to tell you. Apart from doing all of those, validating these newer attack patterns by running test analysis is the only way to start defending against this. The unfortunate news is we are beginning to see this ITGO5 actor actually be more successful within the past couple of months than before. So we got to keep a real close eye on ITGO5. Now, let's talk about what's happening in the world of Common Vulnerability Engine, which is the NVD database. Everyone's familiar with CVE. CVE essentially captures and standardizes the vulnerabilities across various software solution products, features, right? Now, what's interesting is since February 15th, NIST website has been displaying this notice that you see on the top left of the screen. NIST is currently working to establish a consortium to address the challenges in the NVD program. Translation, quick look at the graph at the bottom. None of the CVEs are enriched with metadata since Feb 15. All it is listing right now in the database is there is a vulnerability, but there is no context, there is no details. And if you look in the previous few months, you see a red line and a green line in the bar graph there. All the reds simply indicate that we had consistent metadata that were added on top of the CVEs. How does this impact you? Well, you may not realize this. Most scanners, pretty much every scanner out there that you're using for vulnerability scanning across the enterprise, it relies heavily on the CVE database in order to update information based on your network. In your network, you do your scanning, it identifies there's a vulnerability, and then you see a very well-documented graph with details indicating what the vulnerability is all about. That is missing. So vendors and open source community has been supplementing this information. That is a GitHub CVE repository that allows to basically go ahead and update this information. This is more so for enterprises that are using open source technology that rely heavily on CVE data. Please be aware, you are not getting full metadata context. And if you're looking for any metadata context at open source database instances, GitHub Advisory Database is a good example. And then there is a CVE++. These two are good resources to actually grab additional information of these vulnerabilities. Now, one of the other things that we wanted to talk about in this area is also, if you are a service provider, if you are a product vendor who has CVE vulnerabilities, please ensure that the metadata context and the details pertaining to your information that you already do is well articulated in your website or where you publish your vulnerabilities. This actually helps security researchers and the CISOs and their team, one and alike, very consistently. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper into the rather interesting legislation that came out from EU. AI has been exponentially picking up pace. There's enough news articles out there, enough news on ChatGPT out there. and the billion-dollar evaluations that we consistently see. Now, I think EU AI law, in our opinion, has been one of the most comprehensive set of guidelines that you can really start approaching the rather complex topic of AI law, right? If you look at US, President Biden announced an executive order requiring AI developers to share data with the government. Great starting point. China already has a patchwork of AI laws, and I only called out US and China because of the volume of AI data and AI models that are coming out of these two countries right now. Now, if you look at EU law, in the essence and spirit, it follows the concept of 3H, right? The 3H being helpful, harmless, and honest. That's been our guiding principle in most of our AI model. But one of the key focus of the law is banned application. The new rules ban certain AI application that threaten citizen rights. That includes biometric categorization systems, unsensitive characteristics, and untargeted scraping of facial images. Most importantly, CCTV data. Emotion recognition in the workplace. So we are beginning to see a plethora of tools available in US market where the first or second round of recruitment is done by AI system, and there is emotion recognition during the interview process. This is not going to fly in the European market right now. So emotion recognition in the workplace and schools, social scoring, predictive policing, especially if it deals with profiling a person, and anything that deals with exploitation of people's vulnerabilities is typically banned as an AI application. Second is law enforcement exemption. There's something called as real-time biometric identification system. Your traditional biometric information system, you can store and you can repudiate data against stored systems, but real-time RBI can only be deployed if very strict safeguards are met, and especially by law enforcement. This could be, for example, identifying terrorist activity or identifying terrorists in a crowded area, for example. Obligations for high-risk system. There needs to be a clear obligation set forth for high-risk system, and high-risk system by the new EU AI law is defined as any system that deals with critical infrastructure, education, employment management, essential private and public services. These key foundational systems, otherwise in the US state side, we call it critical infrastructure applications. These have a higher obligation for using AI systems. Transparency requirements, this is kind of what we already know. It's universally getting accepted, but general purpose AI system, otherwise called GPAI systems, the models must meet certain transparency requirements. These includes the EU copyright law, publishing detailed summaries of content used for training, and the more powerful GPAI models that could actually pose systemic risk across the board. Now, this is particularly interesting since if you really look at the essence of how AI models are trained, they are trained heavily on publicly available data. The Wikipedias of the world, the Reddit information stores of the world. So this is a pretty interesting transparency requirement that needs to be evaluated how this is going to go through. And then lastly, measures to support innovation and SMEs, especially regulatory sandboxes and real-world testing will have to be established both at the national level and accessible to small-scale startups, individual contributors. In other words, the law also provides a framework for researchers and AI developers. So European Union is trying to foster an ecosystem of entrepreneurship around AI while also trying to put down quite a bit of regulatory guidelines and guardrails around the entire process of AI law. In my opinion, this is just the beginning. This is not the end-all process of AI law. We are basically in the very, very nascent stages of defining AI and the complexities surrounding the AI model. So this seems to be as a good first step, and we really need to track how US is going to respond to some of this, while President Biden's AI directive executive order is very helpful. There is still a lot of gotchas. Case in point, TikTok. TikTok has a whole set of AI engine. It has developed its own set of algorithms in order to keep promoting more content of similar varieties. I think TikTok would be a great case study to unpack and realistically understand how each country in different parts of the world will approach that as an AI regulated model. Now, onto our last topic here. Between Cedric and I, we just looked at what's really happening out there, the increasing cyber threats, the increasing strategic national defense view on various markets, various countries. So one of the key things that we get asked often when we do our engagements is, what can we do right away? What can we do at a practical level in order to safeguard against some of these key threats? So here's a quick list of threat management for AI systems. Once again, AI is pretty much aggressively being evaluated at most companies that we engage with, and there is some level of implementation, either shadow implementation or authorized implementation. So what we really need to understand about core threat management for any AI system is, first of all, how is the language model trained? If it's an LLM-informed reconnaissance, employing LLMs to gather actionable intel on technologies and potential vulnerabilities, right? So you could leverage the same large language model. You can train the system with very specific actionable intel gathering capabilities. On that note, Hugging Face, you got Olama, you got few of those model repositories where, if you want to explore further, there are cybersecurity specific AI models that are being trained that you could take as a starting point and further train your own organization's requirements in order to fine tune the reconnaissance capability. LLM enhanced scripting techniques, basically utilizing LLMs to generate refined scripts that could be used in a cyber attack. We have seen this. ChatGPT, OpenAI basically has come up with controls in their GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, where when you come up with, when you make a request for a nefarious activity, you're basically said you can't help, or you're basically said this is only for educational purposes. So there is some built-in safeguards being put in place automatically across these threat models. You have the LLM-aided development, utilizing LLMs in the development lifecycle of tools and programs. But then again, we need to be aware, right now where we are with AI is GIGO, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. If you train the system with enough amount of bad information, you're going to get enough amount of bad information out of it, except a little bit more prettier and creatively in a word salad. So the thought process here is, as you go through your evaluation of models, you could leverage the MITRE attack framework. There's a very specific framework from MITRE just for AI system called the Atlas. So mapping out the core requirements against the MITRE AI management framework, threat management framework, actually will get you into a very good starting point. If your teams are, if you're a CISO or a board member trying to understand the threat controls or threat management controls that you have for AI system, here are some of the questions that you could really ask. Do we have a threat management strategy for enterprise AI system? These threat management could be as simple as developing some form of inherent models within the AI system for threat management. On the lower end, it could be simple evaluation of understanding the origin of the threat model, who trained the threat model, what is the source of the training data. So you're basically looking for how exactly is the model trained. That's your key focus point, and what is the strategy to mitigate some of the threats that come out of those. Do we ascertain threat models for AI solutions? In other words, AI is already built in. Some 60 to 70%, according to recent studies, of the AI tools and solutions that are in the market are based on ChatGPT. So when you're buying a new solution where you see a lot of advertisement that clearly says it's AI powered, the key question you're asking is, what is the threat model and how are they actually creating a defensive strategy as the solution is implemented? So you're not directly buying or investing in a threat model. You're buying a product that's a wrapper around a threat, an LLM model that could cause or that could pose a potential risk. how many AI-enabled solutions and services do we have, and what are the identified risks? Once again, it's asset classification. Just the way we did app rationalization in the previous years and looked at cloud ecosystem and said, we now have way too many SaaS applications that is shadow IT. We're going to enter a phase where you're going to see models run off of end users' desktop. So how do you catalog these random bust of models, LLM models, very targeted topic-specific models that are running off of various network segments? How do you catalog them in order to safeguard the data that's coming out of them? Are we training public AI models with internal data? This is the most common issue that I deal with when I engage with a lot of enterprises that are very eager to start leveraging AI. They take their company data, they have some subscription to one of the models, they drop that internal data into the external interface, and now you're officially training a publicly accessible system with your internal company data. Guess what? The next person who's going to ask the question, it's quite likely that some of the data that you submitted will get into a word salad that's going to come out on the other side for the next person. So you're really exposing sensitive data in a public system. Finally, do we have a security policy for AI system? This includes your standard access control. This includes your data management. And then finally, you're also understanding how do you classify the data. And as I initially pointed out, the success of AI system completely depends upon how we train the model. So as long as you have a master data management strategy or a data strategy for your organization where you have clear data classification, sensitive data is tagged confidential, public data is tagged public as an example, and you have a data classification model or a tool that you're using to catalog information across the board, then training an AI system and implementing AI system within the network becomes a rather enjoyable process. I will leave that here. And this is a very large topic. We'll most likely do a separate session just focusing on AI and how to implement AI effectively within an organization. But I hope you, all of you had a good interface into what's happening in the month of April. And I'll turn it back to you, Tom.
Thank you so much. I've got a couple of questions for you guys, actually. Great job, first off. I mean, really good stuff. Lots of stuff in there I hadn't heard about lately, so appreciate that. Let's start with Cedric. Cedric, you had mentioned China is targeting political figures, key companies, people of influence. Don't we kind of do that here too, though? I mean, is that really new?
No, in many ways it isn't, Tom. One of the key things about targeting in the intelligence business is, of course, you want to know who the people of influence are. From a diplomatic perspective, you want to know who your negotiating opposite number is going to be. And if you're a military commander, you want to know who your opposite number is on the other side. So it's a very normal practice in that sense. What's different is the thoroughness and the ubiquity of what's going on now, and it just goes beyond knowing the person's spouse's name or their birth date or their place of birth or how they moved up the ranks of the Communist Party or whatever it happens to be. It goes beyond to more of their personal proclivities, potentially getting into their health conditions. Knowing, not only that they are cleared for sensitive information, but if you remember the OPM hack, the Office of Personnel Management hack, getting in there and not only knowing that the person was cleared, but also their background investigation file, finding out, what those skeletons in the closet are. And that's the risk that I think is key here, is that because of the thoroughness of the Chinese efforts, the OPM hack that I mentioned, but also the Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield hack, and several other hacks that indicate that they're going into as much personal and potentially biometric data as possible. And that is the kind of thing that, as they merge different sources of information, they get a much more thorough picture of the individual that they're targeting, and can potentially using AI, as VJ and I have just discussed, they can use AI type technologies to create a deep fake that is very, very convincing. So that's the kind of thing that we have to be on guard for. And that's why this is so threatening and so different from past intelligence practices.
Let me ask you this, your opinion. You talked about they're grabbing voter records, and your answer to the last question actually is kind of making me kind of double down on this one. But they're grabbing voter records in the UK, New Zealand, other places, that we have allies or whatever. Do you think this is like a long game kind of strategy where they want this data, they're using AI, and then they can kind of tweak messages so that they're kind of finding a more friendly ally to install in some of these government places? I mean, again, I hate giving bad people good ideas, but I feel like that could be a thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's exactly what's going on. And let's face it, those people, quote unquote, have those ideas already. So, we're not giving them anything new. We might give them a little bit of a refinement. But the basic issue that you have here is that they're getting as much data as possible. So not only, just think about this, if you've got the voter registration rolls, not only do you know who the political figures are, but you also know the demographics of the voting group potentially. And you can then start tailoring messages to influence that voting group. You can influence the media that they watch, and therefore they will then present a certain opinion or be convinced that a certain opinion is correct because of extra reinforcing influences that can be sent their way. So this is definitely the long game. And what they're looking at doing, especially on the Chinese side, is going after the electorate itself, going after not only the influence makers, but normal people who maybe have a smaller circle of friends that they can influence, and then those people influence other people, and then that gets you a more favorable policy potentially toward China, and therefore the Chinese can achieve the goals that they want to achieve without having to fight for them, without having to actually go kinetic on a particular target or a particular country. So that's what this is. This is a long game, and it's quite frankly a great example of a new type of asymmetric warfare.
Need to shine more lights on this stuff so people are aware. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Let's shift gears. Jump over to VJ. VJ, you brought up the DDoS attacks. Who's using this now, and frankly, why? Why is it coming back?
No, DDoS has always been there. It's the whole concept is, as with every technology evolution, we have moved to cloud more aggressively, and now DDoS is a different refinement. There is a different sense of purpose and modus operandi that's coming into play, and now the design is not just to saturate and stop the services, but in also to exploit some of these applications so you can gain entry. Now, I'll add a little bit more to what Cedric was saying yesterday to connect both the topics to give us some clarity for our audience here. Social scoring, social policing, and then there's something called as triangulation of user information, meaning you look at the user from 3 or 5 different data sources, and you're able to triangulate and say, here is the profile or persona of different digital identities. Now, why is this important? We are actively seeing the long game is a very important aspect because you're creating a full repository of what's really out there, but the short game is already on. We are actually seeing disinformation warfare happening right now, leveraging these mapped out data. Now, one of the key reasons, going back to TikTok, why there is so much sensitivity around this topic is because of this. You not only have all of the information from the mobile device that's running the TikTok application and the user identity, but you can also get the right type of feed and influence that particular information. Now, let's assume that I have a group of people accessing a particular website, and this website does not want to be, it shouldn't be out there. Let's just say there's an oppressive government that really doesn't want people to access that site. The government could actually stage a DDoS attack. The oppressive institution can stage a DDoS attack very specifically towards those users who are accessing that particular information. Think the Chinese Great Firewall. Think the ability to shut down part of Reddit over a period of time. Think the ability to filter information that's coming through. And to Cedric's point earlier, this is where AI-based warfare, digital warfare, is the next chapter in asymmetric warfare.
Shutting down part of Reddit for part of the day doesn't sound that bad, though. I'm kidding. Depends on which part, right? No, I like that. I really appreciate you unpacking that. That makes it more clear. Speaking of, what about we did a special report with another group, and then we talked about fraud GPT, evil GPT, stuff like that. Are you guys seeing a lot of use from this in the wild?
The short answer is yes. So for a quick refresher for our audience here, ChatGPT is above the ground, Fraud GPT is underground. So what that means is just the way you're able to ask questions to ChatGPT, you can use Fraud GPT to say, construct an email campaign allowing you to gain entry with malware, laced malware, right? So Fraud GPT is available. You can buy it in various dark web stores. And what we are seeing is the entry point for various bad actors is now decreased. Just the way the entry point for a lot of us to leverage ChatGPT has also been lowered, the bad actor entry point has lowered. So what I suspect is going to happen is you're going to see a lot of volume of attacks, and it's already reflecting in some of the low-level attacks that we're beginning to see in our sensors.
Thank you for that. Any last final thoughts, guys? Cedric, we'll start with you. What do you, if nothing else, what do you want people to start thinking about or start doing now?
Yeah, I think, as VJ pointed out, Tom, there are so many different aspects to this, and we're basically at the dawn of a new age in warfare. But the difference about this age in warfare is that everybody's a part of it. So as we talk about fraud GPT and similar things, we're looking at the way in which even, the most mundane user can achieve some really bad things that can, have asymmetric effects on, on not only on individuals, but on entire groups of people and on really entire economies. So this is the kind of thing that we have to look at. Big organizations, huge companies, huge organizations of other types can really be impacted by one small thing or one single actor that has malicious intent, and that's the kind of thing that we have to guard against. So this is, really a dawn of a new, quite dangerous era.
100% there's it. Yeah, definitely. To echo a little bit on Cedric's points there, one of the things that I've been specifically discussing with a lot of the CISO and the CTO community, we need to refine and develop an objective, especially as we're dealing with newer technology, just the way we want the AI systems to be helpful, harmless, and honest. We have to start asking the question, what's the true motive behind a specific type of technology? What is the objective? If something is free, the adage goes, you are the product, so your data is going to be commercialized. If you follow that thought process, what's really important is not just understanding and executing the technology, but how does that impact every citizen out there, every human being out there, and starting to distinguish and leverage the new taxonomy in the world, which is synthetic data, human-created data. So you're human-centric versus machine-centric. So we're really going into the next chapter of sci-fi in real life and asking the right question. What is the real motive? If again, I'm using TikTok as an example. What is the agenda behind TikTok to do X, Y, Z? While there's a lot of revenue being generated in the stateside market, there's a lot of metadata being generated in the market abroad. So what is really more valuable, the short-term gain for all of these influencers, or is the metadata that can be enriched over and over for social scoring of the US population? Does that make a big difference? I think it's very important not just to have the experience, but also dig into the whys and hows. And that's what Cedric and I have been really trying to focus on in recent sessions.
I feel like they've really got the smoke and mirrors down over at TikTok. I mean, they're double dipping and kind of an evil genius about it. You know, I'll say it. I don't care. As always, thank you so much, guys. Wonderful presentation. Always a little bit scary, but good stuff to know about, honestly. That concludes our time together with the guys. Really appreciate them. Appreciate everybody being here today. Our CPE email will be going out in about an hour, so watch out for that. That'll give you credit for today's sessions. Everything now will repeat on the agenda. So if there's stuff that you missed, there was a session that you wanted to see, but you chose a different one, now you can go back and watch these anytime. So any of them are available now for the next 90 days. So please enjoy this content. You can share this with colleagues. Please do. Lots of great information from today's program. So, and of course, they can get CPE credit as well. So that link that you used today to join, you can share that with colleagues. They'll have to register really fast. But other than that, they'll get right in. So that concludes today's healthcare virtual conference. We will see you at future events and the remote sessions that I do more frequently. So thank you all. If you need any help, you can reach out to info@secureworld.io or Tom B at secureworld.io. This concludes the healthcare virtual conference. And like I said, we'll see you at future virtual events. Take care.